Welcome to the Six County Lakes and Rivers Online Conference. My name is Patrick Goggin. I'm with Extension Lakes out of the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. I want to welcome you to our Six County Lakes and Rivers Conference. Today we have a great lineup of folks to talk about challenges to our waters and different activities going on in our waters. And I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. We'll start off by just thanking the Oneida County Lakes and Rivers Association and board and other folks from different partners around the area who helped come together to both plan this event, help as speakers, provide co-hosting, and just be a partner to the world of working on water and helping conserve and protect our lakes and rivers. I'm happy to introduce Mike Engelson. Mike is a longtime partner with the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership. He currently serves as the executive director for Wisconsin Lakes, the advocacy arm of our Wisconsin Lakes Partnership. And Mike is got a legal background. He's got a law degree from UW-Madison and has been working in the world of water conservation for a long time. I think he and I started about the same time in 2008. Mike started as doing different things like membership and other activities for Wisconsin Lakes, and then graduated into the role of executive director and has been serving in that role for a good part of a decade now. And so we're always excited to have Mike as part of our regional conferences. One of the great things that Wisconsin Lakes helps us as champions of water to connect with is the policy and advocacy work of Wisconsin Lakes. And so that's where we're going to start today, with Mike giving us a policy update for water in Wisconsin. So help me welcome Mike Engleson. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Patrick, and good morning, everybody. Glad to have you here. Hope it's as beautiful up there as it is here in southern Wisconsin today. Seems like it's going to be a great day. So hope everyone gets to get out and enjoy that this afternoon. And Patrick did a great job of introducing me and my organization, Wisconsin Lakes. I am the executive director, and we work closely with Extension Lakes as part of the Lakes Partnership. I kind of looked through the participant list. I think I recognized a lot of names, so it's great to see you here. So I'll just jump right into things. This is a legislative update, but I'm actually going to start out with some important legal decisions that just happened that have a pretty massive impact on policy across the board in the state, not just for water policy, but definitely for that to some extent. And those two decisions were in the news quite a bit in the last week. They just came down, I think it was at the beginning of this week, actually. Both are called Clean Wisconsin versus DNR, and both involved questions over DNR's authority via rulemaking under what's called Act 21. Act 21 is a Walker administration era bill that was passed, I believe, right around the same time. It might have been in one of those big 2015 pieces of legislation. But anyway, what it said is that DNR only has authority to do rulemaking when it's specifically, explicitly granted that authority by an enabling statute. So the idea was that the legislature was trying to restrict the ability of agencies to do rulemaking. That's when DNR does things like flesh out the meaning of statutes that have been passed by the legislature. So for instance, the legislature said we shall have shoreline zoning standards, and DNR then promulgated those standards in NR 115. That's an example of rulemaking. So in the past, it had been DNR had fairly broad authority to determine when it had its own authority to do rulemaking. The legislature attempted to restrict that to sort of put the kibosh on as much rulemaking as possible. So the two cases involved here, one involved high capacity wells and whether DNR had authority under the public trust doctrine to look at the environmental impact of a well, even if the statute didn't say that when you're looking at the permit for this well, you have the explicit authority to do so, to look at environmental impacts. And the other involved, it was groundwater testing and animal unit numbers for factory farms, for CAFOs, the question whether DNR had statutory authority to do that in their permit review. And in both cases, the court held that DNR does have authority based on some relatively broad statutes that it said gave the agency explicit authority. So what was important, it differentiated between the terms explicit and specific. You don't necessarily need to remember that, but what it basically said is that the public trust doctrine and the grant of authority by the legislature to DNR to administer the public trust doctrine is very broad, but there are things that requires that explicitly flow from that broad grant of authority. And in effect, it muted much of the impact of Act 21. There's some question because these cases do kind of work against earlier decisions that came out of some of the pandemic-related health restrictions, mandates and things like that. So we'll see how this plays out long term. But these most legal professionals that I've talked to have said these are very, very important and groundbreaking cases, and important also because they were the so-called liberal wing of the court was joined by Justice Ziegler, who's actually normally sides with the conservatives on most decisions. Justice Ziegler, I will say, has been relatively pro public trust doctrine in the cases that I've either read her opinions or heard her ask questions or oral arguments or whatnot. So overall, two really great decisions that are re-establish some agency authority in rulemaking that I think that will be important going forward. All right, now on to the legislation. I always like to just kind of ground us in where we are in the legislative timeline. The Wisconsin legislature sits for two-year increments. It's a biennial legislature. We're in the first year. Elections always happen in even numbered years in November. So the legislature first sat in January. You can see from this timeline that we're just past the budget process, and I'll talk about the budget in just a second. The green arrows indicate when general legislation is usually considered. The legislature takes a break during the summer to most legislators spend time in their home districts talking to constituents and whatnot. They'll reconvene in Madison in November and do the lion's share of passing big bills or anything like that from like November until maybe March of 2022. Then they go on break again to allow people to campaign. The new legislature is elected in November, and the current legislature will come back and finish up whatever is left over to do November and December of 2022. So the interesting thing about the budget, I really didn't think that I would be talking about a completed budget at this point. The budget bill is always introduced by the governor in February, and the legislature then takes it up in the Joint Finance Committee. That's a committee of both members of the Assembly and the Senate, because Republicans control both houses. It's weighted towards Republicans. And that committee decided that they would largely ignore the governor's suggestion and work off of what they call the base budget, which is essentially the budget that the state's currently under, minus anything that was put into that budget that was just for that one budgetary period. So if there was a special project that got some funding, that wouldn't be considered part of the base budget. This legislature, this Joint Finance Committee, for the last couple of budgets, has been pretty zealous about removing anything from any budgetary bills that really is non-fiscal related. So it doesn't have anything at all to do with funding. It's not 100% true that they removed everything, but they've been pretty steadfast in we're only going to talk about fiscal stuff in the budget. And that's true whether it was a Republican or a Democratic priority. So it didn't really make a whole lot of difference as to who wanted to put it in. It wasn't going to go in there if it was fiscally related. They went through its whole process. Again, I thought there was going to be disagreement between the Assembly and the Senate, let alone between the legislature and the governor. But the governor, with some chagrin, I think, and he did employ his partial veto power, but he did sign the budget. By partial veto, I mean the governor in Wisconsin has the ability to just take a line and veto just one single sentence from the budget bill. He doesn't have to decide whether to veto the entire thing. He can, but he just can use it for one line. And so, for instance, he did it in a natural resources related matter this year. There was some funding that was given to some lakes for particular activities. Specifically, you could call those provisions pork if you would like to. They were written in the budget specifically for those particular lakes. I'm sure they were good projects. I actually don't know a lot about them. But anyway, the funding for them, the way the bill was originally written, it was going to take money out of what's called the environmental fund. The governor lined out the sentence that said the money will come from the environmental fund, which pulls from general fund revenue. Then by taking that line out, it no longer said where the money came from, so it defaults to come out of the conservation fund, where the monies come from a different source. So that's an example of how that power can be used. The budget is now 2021 Act 58. You'll probably hear about it. So what's in that budget? To be honest, not a whole lot, especially in terms of water policy. It was not something that any of the conservation groups that I've talked to or myself felt like doing a whole lot of jumping up and down about. There's fortunately nothing at 2015 taking away county control of shoreline zoning level activity in this budget. But there were a whole lot of opportunities that I think were missed in terms of doing things for water quality and for environmental protection in general. But County Conservation Department funding, the governor requested a $12 million per year permanent increase to fund County Land and Water Conservation Department staff. He also included some special funding for climate change mitigation. The legislature chose to only increase it to 11 million. The increase is only for this budget. I think that's an increase of about $2 million a year in funding. The climate change funding stuff was taken out, and we'll have to have this discussion of we're underfunding county land and water conservation departments again in the next budget, because that won't automatically continue to the next budget. The Nulls Stewardship Fund, which funds land purchases for conservation across the state, has been widely popular in both parties. It ran out of its original reauthorization or original authorization before the last budget. It was reauthorized for 2 years at that point. The governor asked for a 10-year reauthorization with $70 million per year in spending, $700 million in bonding, and some other stuff. And the legislature just came back with a 4-year reauthorization at $33 million per year. It's great that it was reauthorized, no question about that. And I think that should be considered a win on that point alone. But it would have been nice to have it back at a full 10-year reauthorization. There are some other details as well. The budget also asked for, and the governor asked for, an increase of $900,000 per year and a reduced cost share to local boating enforcement aids. The legislature said not quite that much, just under $400,000, and no change in the cost share. These are grant monies that go to local municipalities to fund their water enforcement patrols and things like that. The governor, so PFAS, you've probably heard that term. PFAS are a range of, there's thousands of different chemicals that don't degrade very quickly, if at all. So they exist once they're out into the world, they exist. They're called forever chemicals because of that, and have been known to cause cancer and other health problems in humans and animals. The governor had a whole suite of PFAS mitigation and reduction proposals in his budget. And the legislature said, well, we'll maybe put something in about firefighting foam disposal. And there might have been a local grant program put in there. I think that got removed at the last minute, but I wasn't able to find that out before coming on here. The short story is that not a whole lot on PFAS in this budget, unfortunately. Huge place where things are missed. I think in terms of water in general, PFAS and lead line replacements for people who still have pipes to their homes that contain lead, we really missed the boat. There's really very little on water on those issues. Other things that the governor proposed in the budget and the legislature declined: some money for Great Lakes erosion control, floodplain mapping to help mitigate flooding, especially as a result of climate change impacts. He had proposed a $200 per year increase, $200 per year increase in CAFO permit fees. That was rejected. And then the DNR had asked for funds that were raised by aquatic plant management permits to stay within the aquatic plant management program. They don't currently, they just get dumped into the general conservation fund. And that was also taken out of the budget as well. That's the budget. So again, you can see not a ton of like really horrible stuff in there. Incrementally good stuff, I would say. So it wasn't a terrible budget, but it missed many opportunities, at least in our opinion. I got a little bit of time. Quickly go over a couple of pieces of legislation that were not budget related that directly impact lakes. So there was a Supreme Court decision, you may remember from a few years ago now, Moverich v. Lobermeyer, which held that a person who owned lake bed, so on a private impoundment, if they own, so in a natural lake, the state owns the lake bed, but in a dam created lake, a private person might own the lake bed. And if the riparian adjacent to that lake bed was someone different and tried to put a pier, if you're the owner of the lake bed under the court decision, you had the right to say, no, you can't come on my property. This is just the same as trying to build a shed across my property line. I'm not allowing you to put that pier on there. That there was an inherent conflict there between the riparian right to place a pier and the right of property owner to exclude people. The legislature passed a bill that flipped that court decision and made the riparian right for pier placement more prominent. So now a riparian has the right to place a pier or some other structures on privately owned lake bed that's owned by someone else. That was signed into law by the governor. So it is now Act 47 for 2021. The Wisconsin Wetlands Association helped push this bill. They were the main driver behind this. It's called a hydrologic restoration general permit. So the bill would have done, so hydrologic restoration is the idea that you can make a whole watershed work better by restoring upper levels of the watershed to be better hydrologically connected. So reestablishing floodplain or rebuilding a wetland or things like that. This bill would have created a council at the DNR, an advisory council that would have helped learn more about those subjects and give advice to DNR policymakers. That part was actually taken out of the bill for reasons I don't quite understand. But what was kept in was the meat of the bill, which was to create a general permit for any of those kinds of activities. General permits essentially allow someone to do those activities without going through as complete a permitting process as if it was an individual permit. That bill, and if you have any questions about these, you can reach out to me after this and I can go into them in more detail because I know I'm going through them relatively quickly. That bill was passed by the legislature and is just awaiting signature from the governor. And I think the last bill that I'll talk about was this one that is in committee hearings over the next couple of weeks. This bill would allow, it would basically add to the structures allowed to be built in the shoreline setback under shoreline zoning, a fence that was built as like a privacy screen from a roadway that was close to the water. The fact situation that led to this is a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to go into it in too much depth. The kind of fence, the orientation of the fence is not going to cause a whole lot of problems from what I could understand as far as how water would either be kept from running into the lake or add to the speed of the water running into the lake. And the number of places where this would come into effect, where there would be a roadway that close to a water body and someone needing a privacy fence, was fairly low. We're not particularly concerned about it, but it is a shoreline zoning bill. There always has to be a shoreline zoning bill every session of some sort, right? So I had to bring it up. The public hearing has been held in the Assembly, and the Senate committee hearing is scheduled for July 21st. So rose out of a situation, and I think Marinette County, it was sponsored by Representative Mursaw and Senator Felskowski, and it does have bipartisan support, as I understand. I'm going to skip over that. I do just want to talk about quickly, there's a rulemaking that the DNR is working on right now for aquatic plant management permitting. It would sort of consolidate chemical and non-chemical treatment rules into one NR 107, really trying to promote best management practice and adaptive management, not making it a one or the other choice. It's not designed to make chemical management go away by any stretch of the imagination, though there is some industry pushback that's trying to make people think that way. And the reason I bring this up is actually less because of the substance of the bill, but because of the way that pushback is being made. The industry and Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, the state chamber of commerce for businesses that represents a lot of big industries, is really pushing the idea that you need to talk to your legislator about this rulemaking, where the draft language of the rule has not even been announced yet. It hasn't been put out. So there's this tactic that's going on now with rulemakings, because the industry lobby really would like to see administrative rulemakings go away, to try to get them nixed at the legislative level, largely using that Act 21 language that I talked about earlier, which is what makes those Supreme Court cases so important. So if you get wind of rulemakings that you're really in favor of, that are somewhat controversial, we now no longer just have to talk to the Department of Natural Resources or the agency that's doing the rulemaking. We really need to start talking pretty early to our legislators about, we actually are very much in favor of this rule, because at some point they're probably going to start hearing about taking action to try to nix it. Last thing, what are we looking forward to in the future? Well, we have a continued veto threat by the governor that really puts a kibosh on most bills that are going to be extremely problematic or move us backwards in terms of water or environmental conservation in general. I think we're going to see, obviously, a lot of fights over what kind of climate change impact legislation we can get passed. PFAS are a big matter. I wrote this slide well before those cases came out, but there will be a rulemaking fight, and we can't discount the importance of the legislative districting fight that's going to come up. This is, the rewriting of where the boundaries are for different legislative districts. Whether things will continue to be gerrymandered, or whether there will be the maps will be written in a more fair and equitable fashion that don't allow for incumbents to just easily get reelected time after time after time, which is kind of the state that we're in right now. Lots of ways to keep informed. This talk is actually a distillation of a longer talk on the same subject, pre-budget signing, that I gave at the Northwest Wisconsin Lakes Conference. Those videos are all available on the Extension Lakes YouTube site right now, and will be available on nwwislakesconference.org. I can put that in the chat, but they'll be available on there soon as well. So if you want a longer version of this talk, you can hear that there. And I think I am out of time.
Thanks, Mike.